Chapter 1. The conversation was overheard in the local boozer. I was with my friends and work partners. The conversational group sat to my left. I knew the person, but not to talk to, but I somehow got myself talking. The first meet with him was the day after in a town called Salford, in the home of a friend of mine. We talked and agreed with the work in hand. All I needed was my passport, my driving license, which was a provisional but not full, but them sorts of things don't cause a problem in this kind of work. My contact gave me £1,000 for the journey, accommodation, and any other necessities. The job was to start the morning after. I was given the keys to the van plus all relevant documentations and a fake insurance cover. I was given the address to where I was heading, which was to become one long journey. I started up the van and headed back home to think over the no-win risk I was about to undertake. Chapter 2. My alarm woke me at 6 a.m., so it was up, shower, breakfast, and preparations for the trip. I put a bike, a tent, a sleeping bag, and various items of camping materials in the back of the Bedford small back van, locked my front door, got into the van, and headed to Thomas Cook to change some money which I was going to need on the 3-day trip through France into Spain. It was a short trip from where I lived in Openshaw, around 15 minutes into Manchester town centre. Then I headed toward the Mancunian Way with a map that lay upon the passenger seat, with this containing the directions to the hotel. I was to stay in Estepona on my arrival in Spain. The first part of the journey was quite tedious, a 6-hour drive to Dover. It took a little longer due to the traffic in London. I made a few stops on the way at various named service stations, had the odd burger, collected a few snacks, then began on the road again. The motorway was flooded with traffic, the usual commuters, heavy goods traffic, and holiday-makers. At least the weather was pretty warm enough for jeans and a t-shirt, and it was probably around tea time when I arrived at the travel desk in Dover. There were lanes that were in letter preference, guiding the vehicles into orderly queuing positions on a strip of road that had forked off into different sections. I purchased a ticket, return for 2 weeks later. The reason for a 2-week ticket would take off any suspicion than making a quick return. The ticket also allowed you to return any time within the 2 weeks. I began queuing in the relevant section while the stewards of the ferry company waved on the vehicles in front until it was my turn. It was a slow-paced drive onto the ferry. I followed the procession of cars into the bays, which were indicated on the ticket. Once parked, I made my way to the upper deck for refreshments. I took advantage of the £1,000 expense money to purchase music tapes for the rest of the journey. More fast food was consumed, and then I had a stroll around the ferry. I felt a little out of place, as everyone seemed full of the holiday spirit, whereas I wasn't there for sightseeing. I sometimes have a weakness for fruit machines and video games, so when I saw a sign saying Aladdin's Cave, there wasn't many people telling me not to blow some money while I travelled the hour's journey to France. I was in full flow now, eyes glazed to the flashing and tempting lights of the electronic money-makers, but who cared? The money was free, and for me to spend at my leisure, a tenner here, a tenner there, and not seeing much of a return. It was the sound of the speaker system that made me realize that we were coming into the port of Calais. It was pretty lucky, really, because I was about to break out another 20 quid, which would bring the amusement total to 120 quid. I made my way back down to the van. I was in a little bit of a flutter with a slight headache from all the flashing lights. The ferry docked with a bit of a bump as I was coming down the stairs from the 3rd deck, sending me off balance a little, but I finally made it to the car station. The parking area was full-on boarding when I arrived. It was becoming quite empty, and the people behind me did not seem too happy, as they could not move until I moved the van. I got myself in, adjusted my seating position, moved a few crisp wrappers and other shit from my footwell, and alighted down the large ramp that deployed from the back of the ferry. The heat from the French air was warm and refreshing. It felt good to be miles from Manchester and nobody knowing who you are and where you came from. I don't know whether it was just me, but that's the feeling I got. Once on French soil, it felt liberating, miles from home. I started the journey adjusting the driving routine. It took a car nearly hitting me head-on before I realized they drive on the other side of the road over there. I'm not that stupid, but I think after smoking a spliff on the ferry, it could impair your judgment slightly. The first part of the journey was a bit of a blur, nothing more than taking in the sights of beautiful France along the long strips of road, just me and the van and vast fields. The trip to my first port of call was a town called Orleans. On the way I was taking in the sights. Nothing was a problem at that moment. Everything was going well, for now. Chapter 3. It was getting late. I was tired, so I stopped in a town called Olivet, Orleans. The town was pretty quiet, apart from the sound of French music being softly played from some half-empty quiet bars and the odd stray dog. I managed to find a reasonable hotel for the night, made my way to my room, and made the first phone call to my contact in Manchester. I told him where I was so he could contact the guys in Spain to tell them of my whereabouts. I was instructed to only contact the guys in Spain when I reached Malaga. I ended the phone call, got ready for bed, ordered a movie from the hotel TV services before falling asleep halfway through it. I awoke around 8:30, got dressed, threw my rucksack over my shoulder, and headed down to the van. The morning sun had been beating down on it since sunrise. When I opened the door, it was like opening an oven on 220. I rolled down the windows and put a towel on the seat to protect me from burning my ass. I realized now why other drivers had parked under a canopy. I'd think my vehicle was the only one that wasn't. I would need to start thinking smarter than that. I started up and set off once more. I hit a busy motorway on the trip down to the next town, Poitiers. I came to the town where the traffic had come to a standstill. I'd only been on the road a few hours, and I felt horribly hot and sweaty. The heat was overwhelming. I just felt like getting out of the car for a little fresh air, but I was locked in with cars from back to back. The gendarmerie were on the side of the road pulling vehicles. I felt slightly nervous, but there was no need to, as at the moment I was carrying nothing. But to this day I will never know whether I was carrying money concealed in the van. The gendarmerie waved me past, and I carried on. The traffic was beginning to disperse as my journey continued on to Mont-de-Passon. It was getting late. I was to find a hotel here in Mont-de-Passon, but the journey was starting to take its toll on me. I was to check in with my contact back in Manchester. I would spend the night here and make an early start first thing in the morning, toward the border of France and Spain, Bayonne. Little did I know this border would be the downfall of my journey on the return back home with the goods, and which would leave me with a lengthy stay there. Chapter 4. After monotonous hours travelling the journey to Mont-de-Passon, I was becoming very tired, so I decided to take refuge in Bordeaux. Instead of the planned stop in Mont-de-Passon, this seemed a better option, as this way in the morning I could bypass Mont-de-Passon, head through Docks, then straight through the border at Bayonne into Spanish territory. After a restless night in a plush hotel, maybe the red wine contributed to that, I reinstated my journey. The unusual feeling of an extremely hot vehicle awaited me, and the chocolate bar I'd left on the passenger seat had become a packet of goo. I set off, negotiating the heavy traffic through the centre of Bordeaux before getting to the motorway. The French sights on my way to Bayonne were phenomenal. A few hours and a few toll bars and shortening of my expenses later, I approached the border of Bayonne and the Spanish territory. It seemed desolate, but to my knowledge That I know now, the problem arises on your return. I drove a steady speed through the checkpoint for vehicles and into Spanish territory. It seemed easy enough. I didn't see any customs officers hanging around, so it was a smooth drive through. The next port of call was Burgos, a few hours' drive in passing the Basque country which separated Spain and France. To my knowledge, there's been ongoing political disputes between these two countries. The journey started to become more of a chore than a pleasure. The novelty of the beautiful landscapes had run their course. The views were still outstanding, but now the norm. I'd played my music tapes in the car stereo until the vocal lyrics had become distorted. I reassured myself there was only one more day of travelling until I reached my destination of Estepona. There I would be able to chill, get my shit together, and call my contact in Spain. I called my Manchester contact to let him know I would be arriving in Estepona the following day. My message was relayed to the contact in Spain. I was to call my contact back on my arrival in Estepona. He would then give me details of the following day to rendezvous with the firm who were to fix up the vehicle I was driving for my return. It was late afternoon when I arrived in Estepona. I quickly parked my vehicle a good few meters away from the hotel I was to stay in. I alighted from the vehicle with a few clicks and creaks in my bones and headed to my hotel to get cleaned and ready for a well-deserved restaurant meal, no expense spared. I booked into the hotel, took my well-deserved shower, and headed to the Chinese restaurant situated right next door. I ordered half of the menu, ate like a horse, and got myself a little pissed, and then went back to my hotel. I flopped on the bed with the aircon on full crank, and mulled over my next few days' events that were about to take place. I eventually drifted into another restless night's sleep. Chapter 5. I awoke around 8:30 a.m. to the feeling of being in Antarctica. The aircon had been on all night. I switched it off and opened the patio doors to the bedroom. A blast of hot air came rushing in, warming up the room pretty quickly. I went back to the bed and lay down, just staring into space and relaxing. A hot breeze washed over me. My hotel phone began to ring. It was my contact in Estepona. He told me that he'd sent 2 of his workers to pick me up in 15 minutes. I got dressed, called my contact in Manchester and told him the present situation. He had been given my whereabouts by my contact in Estepona. I locked my hotel door and made my way down to reception and met 2 guys who were smartly dressed, wearing sunglasses, and speaking with a Mancunian accent. I got into the BMW convertible that was parked outside the hotel doors. The van stayed where I'd left it the night before. Our conversation was quite brief on the 10-minute journey to meet 2 other people that would perform the work on the van. We arrived at a rooftop bar that overlooked a yacht mooring area. The view looked far into the ocean. 5 of us sat down for coffee and sandwiches, while I was briefed on the actions I was to take. These people did not seem like the job was an important issue, as all of them were nursing a heavy hangover from last night's clubbing. I handed the keys to one of the contacts. The time was now 10:30 a.m. He'd given me instructions to pick the van up at 5 p.m. This was enough time for the mechanics to take out the flooring of the van and conceal 80 kilos of marijuana close to the wheel arches, then weld down the floor, a little sanding, then a coat of car spray paint to hide the weld marks. During this time I took advantage of the local town and then had a spell on the beach. I toasted myself for a few hours and got a little sunburned. I made my way back to my hotel at around 4:30 p.m., took a shower and changed. At 4:57 I received a phone call. It was my main contact in Estepona, which I never got to see. He told me that the van was ready, its whereabouts, and the keys would be left under the left wheel placed by the mechanic. The van was situated 1 mile from the hotel. I locked my room once more and headed for the van. At this stage, my potential crimes were starting to hit home, but I passed this off by thinking of my £5,000 reward on return to England. Not bad for 6 days' work. I found my way to the van, which had been parked among a few other cars on a small dirt track car park which overlooked the beach. I walked straight up to it and reached for the keys under the wheel. They weren't there. I checked the other wheels, but to no avail. By this time I had all sorts going through my mind. I was fuming and made my way back to the hotel, hot, frustrated, and annoyed at the sloppiness of the work. I rang my contact in England. He told me to calm down while he rang the Spanish contact. He would get back to me straight away. Now, when it comes to paranoia, I think I'm in the top 10. So when I got the call from my contact in England saying they'd forgotten to leave the keys, but they would bring them to me, due to my English contact's cocaine habit, which made him a little neurotic, he decided for some reason to start telling me that if I was not sure that everything was going right, fuck it all off and get on the next plane out of there. I dismissed his judgment and told him it should be okay and I will speak to him when I get back. So that was the last time I spoke with him. I put the phone down and the hotel phone rang immediately. The concierge told me there was an envelope addressed to me at the desk. I went down to find the 2 guys that I had met earlier in the day had dropped off the van. I don't know why the keys were not where they were in the first place, but the van was now back in my possession. I went to it, had a look around. Nothing seemed like it had changed. It had the same look, crisp wrappers, etc. in the back to make it look lived in. The mountain bike and tent added to the look. I locked the van and went to spend one last night on fine dining before heading back to my hotel to bed with the alarm call set for 7:30 a.m., ready to hit the road back toward the French border. Chapter 6. I awoke to the alarm call, got up, got myself changed, made the call to my contact in Manchester, paid up for my stay with the hotel, and set off for my 4th day of travelling. Little did I know that there was a van travelling half a mile behind me with 100 kilos of cocaine. I was enjoying the drive back. The views of the Spanish mountains were breathtaking. At one part of the journey I got myself lost and ended up in central Madrid. That was quite stressful, as you could imagine. A van load of cannabis and police on every street corner. I had to keep cool for the trip over the border, so I decided to test myself and my nerve by asking a copper the directions to France. It went well. The copper gave me a small pocket map indicating the route toward France. I carried on and thanked the officer, and after a good few hours driving, I stopped at another hotel in Burgos. This would be necessary before the final major hurdle, which was the French border of Bayonne. The usual night was enjoyed with the mini-bar and room service. After my night's eating and drinking, I settled down for the night. The morning had arrived, and I was up and out, setting off for the next part of the journey. I just passed San Sebastian and was now approaching the French border of Bayonne. I was dripping with sweat from head to toe. The border was empty, and my heart was coming out of my throat, and there were 3 douane customs flagging me down. I pulled alongside the customs garage, which was fully equipped, along with the dogs, car ramp, burning gear, and enough tools to supply Snap-on. One of the customs shouted at me to get out of the car. I looked like a lobster after my day toasting on the beach. The French customs officer started speaking fast and in an angry tone. I didn't understand a word of his French until he pronounced the word papiers, of which I presumed it would be my documents. I reached to the glove compartment on the passenger side and took out the documents he'd asked for. I passed them to him, and he immediately took my passport from the paperwork. He then passed it over to one of his lady colleagues, and she proceeded into the office. The officer who'd just passed on my documents was quite aggressive as he ordered me out of the van, putting the handcuffs behind my back. He led me into the garage to sit on a stool. He then added another chain through the handcuffs onto a wall that had a bar welded onto it. I was left alone in this garage for a couple of minutes, which felt like a couple of hours. My mind was blank. I could not think of anything, but if they found what was in the van, I knew I was looking at a nice prison spell. 2 Alsatians were on either side of the garage giving me the eye. They were loose, so I kept extremely still to avoid being bitten. The van turned into the garage and onto the ramps. The customs officer, who I first encountered, came over to where I was and began screaming his French obscenities at me once more. Then he went into the back of the van and began throwing out all the items that I'd placed there. There was a lot of customs officers coming and going. Through a door to the left of me there were a lot of French conversations and computers tapping. In an office to my left, from inside the rear of the van, I could hear banging about. After about 15 minutes without any of the dog's assistance, the customs officer shouted loudly to one of his colleagues, "Chocolate! Chocolate!" Another customs officer came running in. I thought this was all a bit much for finding one of my melted dairy milk chocolate bars, but this was not the case, as in the centre of the van there was a small metal disc welded to the floor, which is an inspection panel for mechanics to inspect the undercarriage of a vehicle. The customs officer had prized this open with a flathead screwdriver. There was laughter from the 2 officers in the back of the van as they shone their torch through the inspection panel to each side of the wheel arches containing the 40 kilos on each side. One of the customs officers came from the back of the van and released the chain from the wall but left on my handcuffs. I was then marched into a corridor where I was seated once more and rechained to a similar bar connected to the wall. I sat still for around 5 minutes, and at that stage knew I was in deep shit. All I could think of now was to somehow get friendly with one of the customs officers to let me have the bottle of red wine that was in my rucksack that I'd paid 37 euros for, because I knew it was the last time I was going to get pissed for a while. Chapter 7. I sat and waited for one of the customs officers, who began to bring in the brown cellophane-wrapped kilo blocks of cannabis. In front of me lay 2 tables, 8 foot long. On top of the tables were industrial-sized scales. The blocks of cannabis were stacked at the side of the scales. I was counting the blocks as he was coming to and fro. I got the amount to 70 blocks. I found this a little strange, as there should have been 80, but I was not going to question anything at this stage, because the more you speak, the more problems arise. He began to place the blocks on the scales. This took a considerable amount of time, as he was in and out of the customs office, answering phone calls and other issues. By the time that all the blocks were weighed, it had taken around 45 minutes. This was logged in some sort of manual that lay beside the scales. This was the last time I saw the cannabis, after I'd had my photo taken with the goods, with 6 customs officers standing behind me joining in for the photo shoot. I was then moved to a small cell about 4 foot by 6. It was painted in bright yellow. The door was slammed shut before I could ask for anything. I was left in there without shoes, and just a thin mattress and a bright light flickering at the top of the room. I lost track of time at this stage, and I was feeling tired, and I then fell asleep. I couldn't have been asleep for long when the door to the room was opened, and I was led into another room, which was the interview room. This room had a large window that overlooked the place where they'd stopped me in the van. I was questioned in broken English by who seemed to be the head of customs. My guess, due to all the medals he was brandishing on his shoulders and the biggest table in the office. My answers to each of the questions were just a yes and no. The interview lasted around 30 minutes before I was placed back in the holding cell. I didn't have a clue what was going on. It was now becoming dark. I could tell this as there was a gap about an inch at the bottom of the door, which gave a little light from the outside world. I had a dreamless night. I awoke to the door being opened once more. This was the start of the next day. I was escorted, handcuffed, and led to a police van that awaited me outside the customs checkpoint. This was the handover from the customs to the local town of Le Bon Gendarmerie Police. I was then whisked away, which seemed about 3 miles, to the police station in Le Bon. Here I was placed in a holding cell, and I was held here for about 4 hours. The cell was not like your usual Manchester prison cell. You was on full view. It looked like a scene from Silence of the Lambs. Not as grotesque, but the cell setup was. I was then taken to an interview room where an officer and a translator were present. The questioning began, with the officer speaking in French, and this was explained to me by the translator present. It was the usual questioning. Who do you work for? How much were you paid, etc. It seemed like this was the usual routine, questions that I'd been asked before. But still handcuffed to a wall, I didn't have any clue where they thought I was going. I had to quickly make up a cock-and-bull story that my job was to take the van out of Spain for sale there. This was all the information that I was given by my contact in Manchester. Of course, this was total bullshit. That was up to them to find out. I explained that I was not an experienced criminal that they were used to, but someone who was just doing something to correct my finances in England. 50% true. They didn't buy it anyway, and after that hour interview I was placed back into the Hannibal Lecter's cell, where I stayed until the next day. It was a lovely night ahead, on a wooden bench about 3 foot wide, 6 foot long, and about 12 foot by 8 diameter room. At this point I knew I was going to have a lot of problems. I hadn't eaten for a while, and I was real hungry. Chapter 8. After a rough night's sleep, I was woken by the sound of the police banging about. I didn't have a clue what time it was, but my body clock told me it was early. The cell door was pulled loudly open, and I was marched into a basement garage, handcuffed. There awaited 2 more gendarmerie police, who roughly pushed down my head into the back of a small Renault police car. My details were passed from the Le Bon police to the Bayonne police. A few brief words were exchanged from each copper, and then we were on our way to the police station in Bayonne. This journey took roughly 20 minutes. On arriving at the police station, we descended into a basement car park similar to Le Bon, where myself and the 2 police officers alighted from the vehicle. We walked across the car park and into a lift to a first-floor headquarters. I was then released from my handcuffs and placed into another cell once more, but this one was a little more upmarket compared to the customs cupboard, larger, with a giant glass window and door totally on view to all and sundry. It was the same type of cell as Le Bon, but a little clearer. I was given a ham baguette, an apple, and a carton of orange juice. There was a clock outside of the cell, which read 9:30 a.m. Once again the sleeping arrangements were shit, but I managed to slip in a few hours before being woken by a CID-looking character. I was taken from my cell and led to an interview room where I was met by a French translator. From now until my trial day, this would be my go-between, to convince the French justice system that I wasn't a habitual criminal. I sat next to the translator, and the officer sat across a desk from me as the questioning began to take place. The same questions as the customers asked, so it was a good job I'd been memorizing my story. I was to take a vehicle to Spain for sale, but ended up bringing it back due to the would-be purchaser's lack of interest and me not knowing what I'd brought back, saying that I'd been duped into something, not knowing. It sounded like a pile of shit, but it was the only story I could concoct as my mind was set on not being caught. I stuck to this story, even though they tried their best to twist my words into admitting that I was part of an international organization, which I thought was quite funny. Due to my lack of cooperation, my translator told me that because the officer did not believe a word I was saying, and I don't blame him, I was looking at a maximum of 10 years imprisonment. My heart sank. I felt breathless and dazed. The interview was finished, and I was told I would spend the rest of the day and night here before I was taken to the examining magistrate's court early the next morning. Unlike English law of innocent until proven guilty, the French like to do things the other way round. I was told that in the morning I would be offered a list of advocates, solicitors, to choose from, and this would be my legal support up until my day of sentencing. I was to tell the examining magistrate my story and hope that she could somehow believe it and go light on my predicted future sentence. I didn't know at this point that it would be in 10 months' time. I was led back to my cell and given a flea-bitten blanket. It was now 1:25 p.m. It was going to be a long wait until morning. It's hard when you have a loud ticking clock facing you outside of your cell. Minutes are like hours. The only thing you can do is resort to your own mind and memories of a better place. It eventually reached 8 p.m., and the police headquarters hustle and bustle seemed to quieten down as I slipped into a nightmarish sleep. Chapter 9. The morning came too soon. There were no questions asked, and I was quickly escorted to the nearest remand centre. This was Bayonne. This was the real deal. No mussing about. No glorified bollocks. This was more like Papillon. I was met by the most horrible screw you could ever meet. His job was to take you in, take your shit, all that was left of your worldly goods, what the customs douane had not already taken, and whisk you right down a corridor into the main prison holdings. 40 cells, side by side, with the upper floor making a total of 160. Looking at this from above, there was a flight of stairs at each end of the holding area. I was taken into an infirmary and given a medical by the prison nurse, then straight into a cell, 9 foot by 6 foot, cell number 4. The far left of the prison, on the bottom. One terrifying experience that's hard to forget. This humble abode contained one ignorant, psychotic Dutch guy who could speak only broken English. For example, "Allo, goodbye, thank you, and fuck off," about as much use as a chocolate fireguard. One Yugoslavian, not a word of English, one French guy, say no more, and me. What the hell do you do when not one of you speaks each other's languages? The cell door slammed shut. I was given a few of my items I had in my rucksack, a couple of shirts, pants, a couple of pairs of underwear, and 3 packets of Marlboro cigarettes. I wasn't much of a smoker, but I think it was now time to take up the habit. There wasn't any type of rule book that gives you guidance into the settling in of your new home. I would have to play it by ear. I felt a little intimidated by the prying eyes of my cellmates. I took a look around and positioned myself onto the bottom bunk, the only one available. I realized that you'd have to wait a while for a top spot in this joint. A couple of sheets were there for me, so I made my bunk. The 3 other guys carried on watching the TV, which was showing Precio Justo, which is the Spanish version of The Price is Right. Quite amusing when I think of it now, as none of us could speak each other's language, and none of us could speak Spanish. I climbed into my bunk and lit up a Marlboro. I had not taken 2 puffs of it before the French guy above me gestured to me, dangling his arm over the edge of his bunk. "S'il vous plaît, une cigarette pour moi." It didn't take a rocket scientist to work out what he wanted, so I passed him a cigarette, to which he replied, "Merci." From my schooling days, I knew that meant thank you. There was silence in the cell, as you would expect with the language barrier. I stared around the cell. To my right was a sink and toilet close together, a makeshift washing line that contained socks and underwear, but I couldn't see the washing machine, just a bucket that was full of more clothing. So this looked like the washing arrangements. One bucket between 4. This toilet area was covered with a mop pole and a sheet. This was the only privacy you had. The noise and the smell couldn't be hidden. This place was hell, and I had no idea what was to become of me. It was around 7:30 at night, and I began to think of my family. I felt dizzy, confused, and alone. It wasn't long before I fell asleep. The only way to escape this place, thinking and hoping tomorrow would have some kind of explanation of what was to become of me. Chapter 10. The sound of unlocking bolts echoing around the cell startled me out of a deep sleep. The solid old oak door to the entrance of the cell swung open. The demented Dutch guy stood at the door. A French screw stood on the outside of the door, jangling his keys, with a blank expression on his face. The breakfast trolley had arrived, and we was each given a large French stick, a small pot of jam, a pat of butter, and a sachet of coffee, dried milk, and sugar. I got out of my bunk and approached the screw and said, "Can I have a word with the head of the prison?" He looked at me as though I was from another planet, as he slammed the cell door shut, locked it, and threw back the 2 bolts secure. The French guy above me just laughed. The Dutch guy was talking to himself as he lovingly buttered a quarter of his French stick, and the Yugoslavian guy was doing the same as he sat at a desk that occupied the cell. This was the study area for us all. I sat back on my bed and wondered how long these people had been here. I followed the ritual and ate some of the French stick with a little apricot jam on it. I would have preferred strawberry, but they were quickly snapped up by the other guys. You know what they say, first up, best dressed. I finished off my breakfast and wrapped the rest of the French stick in a polythene bag. At this point, I didn't know how long this bread was supposed to last. I stepped toward the cell door and looked through the spy hole. The metal plate that covers the hole from the outside was slightly bent, giving me a 45-degree view of the left side. I could just see the breakfast trolley serving prisoners on the cells facing. The trolley moved out of sight. I sat back down on my bed, got a pen and pad the prison had given me on my arrival, along with 2 envelopes and 2 stamps. I wasn't sure at this point how I could send this letter, as I didn't think the screws would let me nip down to the local post office. But anyway, I began to write my first letter to my mother, telling her that I'd made a mess of things and I don't think I'd be coming home for a while, and that I loved her, and I'm sorry. The next letter I wrote was to the local consulate. I was given this address on arrival at the prison. His name was Bob Hope. Quite a surreal name, don't you think, considering what I was in this place for? The time was 7 o'clock. The rest of my cellmates were watching the TV, Euro News. This time at least one of us could understand the language. No prizes for guessing who, as it was a French channel. I finished my letters, sealed them, and asked the French guy in a waving gesture as to how I get these in the post. He waved his cigarette and spoke the words, "Tous les matins place, le poste on le porte." I didn't have a clue as to what he was saying, and thought to myself, I don't know why I asked him. Then I realized before I set off on my journey, I put a French phrase book in with my belongings. I looked at my possessions, and there it was. I couldn't believe it. This was the answer to surviving this place. Learn the language and learn the ropes. After an hour's reading, I had got hold of the simple needs of surviving in this place. What the French guy had told me earlier was that every morning the post is collected by a screw. You must make sure that you place the letter into the tiny slot that was on the back of the cell door. I would do this at the night time, ready for the morning. The time was now 8:30 a.m., and I was startled by the cell door being unbolted once more. The screw shouted, "Promenade!" I'd only ever heard of that word when visiting Blackpool, but I'm sure he didn't mean that we were going for a walk on the Golden Mile. I watched as other people passing the cell looked in. One of the inmates stopped and spoke to the French guy. He jumped off the top bunk and made his way after them. The Yugoslavian followed. The Dutch guy stayed watching the TV. The screw reappeared and shouted and waved at me. "Allez!" I quickly put on my trainers and followed this chain of inmates, scared and wary of all the new faces. We walked down the prison to the end. I looked up to my right and noticed a door with leaflets attached to it with the word "Bibliothèque." I needed to look up this word, as I didn't have a clue what the fuck it meant. I looked at my bottom left and noticed a kitchen area right facing me. I could see, through the bars, a couple of prisoners preparing the shit that was delivered daily. We stopped as the screw opened up a metal door that led into another corridor which contained 3 other metal doors. I took a quick peek through the spy hole of one of the metal doors and saw other prisoners walking around a small yard, approximately 30 foot square. One of the other doors opened and we were marched into it. It was the same size as the one I'd just looked at. There were about 20 of us to share this walking area, and these 20 were the dodgiest-looking characters I had ever seen. Chapter 11. On my own, I followed the procession of cons, listening and hoping for an English-speaking person, but there was none, just the sound of Spanish and French. I knew this was going to be hard. I kept my eyes averted from the other cons. This wasn't the place to start trouble. There was no way out, and by the looks of these characters, scar faces, missing teeth, raggedy clothing, and potential murderers, who knows what would happen. There were cons in pairs, cons in threes, all talking and laughing. There were a few that were like me, walking alone. The paranoia was intense, but if anything was to happen, it would be pot luck to single me out. It was about 15 minutes into the meaningless walk, looking at the scraped graffiti along the walls, dates and names which derived from the 1970s. I noticed that on the floor was a square hole that had been cemented over. I was later to learn that this is where the blocks were positioned for the guillotine. The French abolished the chopping off of heads in the late 80s. Lucky for me that I'd missed that era. Until the first incident happened. Some words were spoken between a French guy and a Spanish guy, and before you knew it, the French guy was floored with a mass of blood pouring from his head. The procession carried on. The French guy sat in the corner, cradling his wounded forehead, as the Spanish guy carried on chatting and laughing with his friends like nothing had happened. During this brutal incident, the screws either ignored this or never heard. Even so, it did not fill me with any sort of safety. The cell that I'd come from, I wished I was back in. My heart was pounding, and I wondered how long the endless walk would be before we went back, so I just carried on walking, averting suspicious eyes. It was an hour later before the screw that let us out unlocked the door for our return journey to our cells. I was relieved. The military march was the reverse of when we first came out. I returned to my cell. The cell door was bolted once more, and so began the arduous boredom of sitting on my bunk and listening to the odd lone rant and rave from the crazy Dutch guy. A few hours passed as we watched French TV before the door was unbolted once more, at just after 12 p.m., with dinner service in tow. I was starving, as the French stick didn't fill me up much earlier. 4 trays were delivered, and, as usual, the Dutch guy took control of the water service. I took my tray as the cell door was bolted once more. I sat on my bunk with legs crossed and the dinner tray on my lap. I took a look at the meal in front of me, which I can only describe as horrid. The 4 compartments of the tray consisted of one hand-sized portion of some strange kind of meat, which I learned at a later date to be horse meat. It may sound nice to some people, but I much preferred ribeye steak. The second compartment consisted of cold diced carrots, peas, and swede, mixed together with mayonnaise. The third was what looked and tasted like sauerkraut, and the fourth, and finally, was dessert, which was a small tin-foil tin of apple compote, which looked like a Heinz tin of pureed apple baby food. I took one bite of the meat and spat it straight back out. It tasted foul. As for the rest, I left for the other guys to dissect, and they did. I think you have to get a taste for the stuff before you can enjoy it, but it wasn't for my palate. I took out my bread that I'd saved and went for a good old jam butty once more and hoped for a better meal at tea time. Half an hour later, the bolts to the cell went once more, and the dinner trolley arrived for the pickup. My cellmates lay on the bunks and napped, like their body clocks were timed to perfection. I myself joined in the fashion, and drifted in and out of sleep, once or twice being woken by the jangle of the screw's keys and shouting from other prisoners in cells somewhere in the prison. It was 2 in the afternoon before the dreaded bolts went again and the screws shouting promenade. I was definitely going to give it a miss this time round, so I was left with the crazy Dutch guy. I don't know what was worse, in the cattle yard or the insane cell. I just lay and stared at the TV, which was showing MCM's music channel, the equivalent of MTV, only this channel preferred to show 10 French songs to 1 English and plenty of repeats. After the other guys had come back to the cell, it was another couple of hours till 5 o'clock before our evening meal arrived. Boy, was I hungry. The trays arrived into the clutches of Dutch, and I quickly snatched mine like an animal, took the same seating arrangement, and stared in dismay at the next offering. Steamed tripe, herring in tomato sauce, new potatoes in mayonnaise, and fruit cocktail for dessert lay before me. I ate the potatoes and fruit cocktail, but there was no chance of me finishing the rest. Once again, the rest of my cellmates helped eat my leftovers before the food trolley arrived once more for the pickup. This was to be the final lock-up for the night. I took a shit in the minimal privacy suite, had a wash, brushed my teeth with the prison-issue wire toothbrush that I was provided with, put my letters into the door slot, and settled down for the night of French TV. Entertainment. I think it was about 9 p.m. I finally fell asleep, waiting the morning once more. Chapter 12. The morning came with the same events as the morning before. I joked with myself, and now thought that's why the French invented the word déjà vu. I made a point of giving my letter to the screw, and he placed them into a box that he was carrying, along with a collection of other letters. The in-mail was distributed to my cellmates also. This same routine carried on for 2 weeks. Until this time, 2 good things happened to me. In one day I received mail back from my family and the consulate. I read my family letter first, which brought tears to my eyes. It mentioned that they would give me support, and my father would be coming to see me as soon as I had words with my consulate, which was the next letter I read. It told me of a date of which he would be visiting me to tell me of the procedures I would need to follow to get me through this prison term, and addresses to a company called Prisoners Abroad. This is a charity that sends a magazine subscription to the unfortunates that are incarcerated in foreign lands, also support and guidance for dealing with your incarceration. As I was flicking through this information, there was a shout through the door to me in English. I jumped up and looked through the spy hole to see a large guy. I couldn't believe it. This guy, called Mario, told me that there were more English prisoners in here, but you need to put in for a cell transferred to the upper floor. He slipped me a letter through which was written in French, asking the governor for the move. I was ecstatic. Just a littlest of any hope in this place was enough, and now I knew that a bit of my sanity would return. I rewrote this letter and handed it to the screw at the next bolt-opening event. Day after day I waited, and the food issue changed as I found out about the prison canteen that was delivered to your cell every 2 weeks. This was a choice of groceries that were brought in from local shops, an order sheet that had to be filled in twice per week, along with a lump sum of money from your prison account. These monies were held in the prison office. Monies could be sent to your account from relatives in postal orders addressed to the prison governor. The standard prison food was okay, about twice a week. The rest of the week was substituted with tuna and sweet corn. After another week of patiently waiting for my transfer, the day arrived. I had already been packed because, while I'd been in there, I'd never unpacked. I was moved to the upper floor into cell 40. In there were 2 English guys who greeted me, saying, "You took your time." The word had gone around there was another English guy that had arrived. I was happy for now, but this was to be short-lived. Chapter 13. The 2 guys I'd moved in with. One was a so-called Salford lad from the city of Manchester, acting the goat, thinking he knew it all. The other was the brains of the 2, a little more sensible. Anyway, that was a different story. I had accomplished what I had aimed for, and that was to get from the Devil's Canyon downstairs at number 4 to where I was now with the rest of the English. It was around 4 o'clock, and the stories from the Salford lad were meaningless and boring, the kind of stories that make you a little sleepy. These 2 had already been in this place for 11 months, so that didn't fill me with a lot of hope of getting out and spending my birthday at home, which was to be in a few weeks' time. But this was a distant dream. My 2 new cellmates were still under investigation by the examining magistrate. This was the person I'd mentioned earlier. His or her job was to hold you for as long as they can in the remand centre, hoping somebody may send you a letter that was incriminating to your case, or you decide to break under the pressure of this prehistoric remand centre and tell them all and sundry. It turns out that the 2 I was in with had been back and forth to the courtrooms, and the pair of them couldn't get any story to match. I was more concerned about my case, but their case was quite amusing, trying to cover up to 140 kilos of cocaine in a van, double what I had. The next day came with the same routine, but today, instead of the screw shouting promenade, he shouted sport. I'd already been told by my 2 cellmates that we had a sports area, but it had been in repair for the past few weeks, so today was the day to mix it with the whole of the prison population, which included Mario and around 5 other Englishmen, together with a few English-speaking good Dutch guys. We headed for the metal doors again at the bottom end of the prison, and through a new door that had previously been boarded up. Through this we passed the showers and into a blazing hot, old-looking open space, half the size of a football field. In this area there were several people playing a French game named pétanque. This was the equivalent of crown green bowling, only with smaller metal balls. In the corner was a game of handball, Basque country style. There was a small alcove which contained a table tennis area and gym facilities, also the sports officer. I decided to take a seat on a concrete ledge that was on the side of the wall in the football field and check out the surroundings before approaching anyone. The same routine took place here, a procession of inmates walking around, but on a bigger scale. It wasn't long before overhearing an English conversation taking place by 3 guys that passed me. I decided to take this opportunity to introduce myself. I got up and slowly walked over to them. The guys I met were Charlie, a mature, wise man, a Dutch guy with a perfect take on the English language, and a lot saner than the guy from downstairs. And last was the guy named Mario, who helped me get to the upper level. My prayers had been answered. I knew I could rely upon Mario to give me the ins and outs of this French hotel, and most importantly of all was how to get the fuck out of here. Chapter 14. Mario explained to me that to get out of here would be a long process, as he had been here for 2 months already, and his case was nowhere near finished before he was found guilty or not. He had been arrested on the way out from England, with a car loaded with £250,000 stashed in the door panels. He would have to prove that this money was for business purposes and not for the financial means of drug importation. He told me that this would be a lengthy process to try and convince the examining magistrate we believed that we were all innocent. The older guy, Charlie, had been in here for 1 year. He'd been extradited from Spain in connection with an alleged big crime syndicate involving large quantities of cannabis heading for England. The Dutch guy had been under investigation by the French authorities and the Dutch police for the attempt of importing ecstasy into Spain. He'd been here the longest of the three, 1.5 years. These people were shady and very cagey and would not give much info away due to the fear of any prisoner giving the police info that they did not have. If someone was to do this, it would go good for you and maybe give you the chance of a lighter sentence. This was just prison gossip that could never be proven. But people were sly like that, and seen as though it was dog-eat-dog in this place, it was thought it was worth a try. By the way I looked at it, this seemed like a silly idea. My theory was, if you knew more, they would want to know more, hence you stay more. We walked around the field a number of times, and I'd not had much chance to explain my story, but I suppose they didn't want to listen. They just wanted out of here, and so did I. The conversations consisted of when they'd get to court and resolve their case. It had been a slow 2 hours before it was back to the cells. The two new guys I was sharing my cell with, Dave and Neil, had finished writing letters to their loved ones back home. I was so confused, not knowing what I was to expect from this experience. It was 3 p.m. I climbed onto the top bunk of our 3-tier bunk bed. This position was terrible. It seemed like there was no air. It was clammy, at least 85 degrees. I was profusely sweating. The single sheet I lay on was soaked. I felt very uncomfortable and agitated. It was miserable. We were only able to shower twice a week, Mondays and Thursdays. Today was Friday, so you can imagine the smell that this cell produced with 3 males inside. I lay and watched the usual French rubbish on TV. As I lay there, I began to think of what I was going to do in the next couple of days to make life a little easier. I'd heard that a few other English guys had applied for work in here, Service General. This was the job title. It was just a glamorized work title for a cleaner, but this work would give you a cell change to another part of the prison where you were trusted to reside with other prisoners outside of your cell in a communal area. There were games to play, chess, cards, and access to the library all day. Everybody wanted to do this, so the jobs were limited. 22 hours per day caged in was unthinkable, so this was the only type of escape you were going to get. The library was situated to the far right of the upper floor where I was now staying. I had mentioned this before, but until now I'd not known that this room was the bibliothèque. I decided to write to the prison governor, of which I've been told would be a tedious process. People had waited up to 3 months for any type of reply, but nevertheless, if you don't try, you don't get. So I decided that I would write 1 letter per week until I got a reply. I completed the letter, and I would place it in the doorpost slot on the final lock-up every Friday night, ready and waiting for the governor on Monday morning. It had now approached tea time, and the ever-clockwork arrival of the food trolley with gourmet slops had arrived. I had received my outdoor canteen order, which I'd paid for, so I would be eating my own food and passing on the prison grub. My own food consisted of tuna, sweet corn, and French stick with mayo. This was my food supplement 4 days of the week. The other 3 days the prison food was quite edible. Final lock-up had arrived once more, and at around 7:30 p.m. I drifted off to sleep, ready for what the next day might bring. Chapter 15. After breakfast I was feeling good, as I'd received 2 letters. These were the replies from the 2 I'd sent 2 weeks earlier, one from the consulate, Bob Hope, and one from my family. My family letter was quite moving. I didn't expect to have received such a positive response from them. They said they'd stick by me, and they would send me money once per month. In this place it's essential that you have money, as your life could be hell otherwise. To this day I don't think they realized that this support meant the world to me, and it picked me up from the potential suicidal feeling. The consulate letter told me that he would be visiting me today, to tell me of my fate and an honest overview of the way to get through my predicament. It was early morning, and Mr. Hope was to visit me in the afternoon. This was normal procedure for every English prisoner. But I was on a high, and felt I could get out of here quickly. This shouldn't have happened to me. They should understand that I was no big-time drug smuggler. Anyway, I stayed in the cell the rest of the morning, feeling anxious, awaiting my visit. The prison's crew opened up the cell at 2 in the afternoon, and I was led down into the visiting area where Mr. Hope awaited, cigar in hand, Rolex on wrist, looking like a throwback from a James Bond film. I sat down and listened to Mr. Hope explaining what was to become of me. He told me that, like other English drug smugglers before me, who had come to Bayonne prison, I would stay here until the examining magistrate had made an inquiry about my trip, and to make sure I was not a habitual criminal. I already knew this from my meeting with Mario, and he'd recently sent a letter home to his family. In the letter he had written, he was having a joke and said, "In this place they want to know everything. Yes, sir. No, sir. 3 bags full, sir." A popular nursery rhyme. The examining magistrate took this the wrong way, and thought he was making arrangements for more alleged drug jobs. This held up his case a while until he could explain himself. He did this by asking a member of his family to send the examining magistrate a book of popular nursery rhymes, highlighting the rhyme in question. Let's put it this way, she wasn't pleased with that. The investigations that were to be made were not something I knew about, but once they were concluded, then I would be sentenced. This process, Mr. Hope explained to me, could take between 1 to 2 years. My heart sank. Mr. Hope explained this to me as matter of fact, as he smoked his cigar. The only good advice to me was to get character references from anyone back home who would vouch for me. This way, when my court date did arrive, the sentence would be low. I asked him what the worst-case scenario could be. He replied with anything from 1 to 10 years. At this point I felt dizzy and sick. He told me of a number of solicitors I could write to take on my case. He explained that if I was to start work for the prison, this would go good for me. I told him I was in the process of applying. I spent around 20 minutes talking with Mr. Hope before we shook hands, and he wished me good luck, and he would contact my father and give him directions of a good hotel if he were to visit me. His job was now done. He left, and I was marched back down to my cell. My cellmates, Dave and Neil, asked me what he'd said. I told them that this was the same advice they'd been given. I got back onto my sweat-soaked bunk once again. I spent the night feeling depressed and worried about my future. I had to get over this feeling and hope that when my trial date did come around, the prosecution would go easy on me. I spent the next couple of months with the same routine as every day. Breakfast in the morning, then a walk around the small yard, back to the cell, have lunch, then out to the gym area for a little weight training, back again, lock up until tea time. Then food arrived, followed by the final night's lock-up. This was repeated, and nothing changed, only deeper depression, until one day, after 4 months' misery with arguments and fights and at least 10 cell changes mixing with the prison lunatics, a screw arrived giving me orders to see the governor. I was worried. I had no idea what this was about. I was marched down to his office where I was asked to sit down. My letters had finally got through to the prison governor. My time on the job waiting list had arrived. I was thrilled. Just the change was good enough for me. I accepted the position of Service General, which was to take effect immediately. I went back to my cell, gathered my belongings, and was moved to the area I'd been wanting to go to since my arrival. It was a separate part of the prison. 10 cells are facing each other, with a row of tables in the centre of the clearing. Prisoners were seated playing cards and chess. I felt relieved to have a little of my freedom back. I was put into a 4-man cell, sharing this cell with an Englishman called Dave, a Dutch guy called Costa, and a German guy called Ulf. These guys were okay, and a far cry from the psychos I'd been shacked up with previously. I had a feeling that things were going to get a little easier now. They all greeted me, and it felt good. Chapter 16. I started work first thing in the morning at 6 a.m. with a guy named Pedro, a black Spanish guy who spoke broken English. This was Pedro's last day, as he was to leave in the morning for the main prison. He'd shown me the ropes. This was to collect the food trolley from the kitchen gates that were near the promenade area and deliver the breakfast to all cells. It was good to be on the outside of cells doing what I'd seen other prisoners doing for the last 4 months. It was hard to explain what sights there were to be seen from the prisoners in each of the cells. Some were normal-looking, with sentences for car theft right up to killers and Basque terrorists, scary people, prisoners committing suicide during the night, but you could never see what was going on, just the screams. I also delivered lunch and dinner, the same job as the breakfast deliveries. After dinner was served, we were locked up for a screw change, then let back out to carry on with the day's duties, which were cleaning of the prison hallways, sweeping up, cleaning of the screws' toilets, which wasn't the most pleasant job in the world, the governor's office, the medical, and the dentistry rooms. This work took most of the afternoon, so time went quickly. This was a daily routine for me, which carried on for 10 months until the day of judgment arrived. My friend Mario had been let out 2 weeks previous. The French justice system could not prove that the money that was concealed in the car was for drugs purposes, so he was freed, with the confiscation of the money, plus a £50,000 fine which was to be paid on his arrival in England. I don't know to this day whether he paid that. Dave and Neil, the 2 guys I shared a cell with before I moved to Service General, were sentenced to 3 years. They'd already spent 13 months on remand here in Bayonne, and they were shipped out to a main prison near Bordeaux called Usage. That was the last I saw of them. The rest of the prisoners I'd come to know were still awaiting their trial day, as their crimes were of a serious nature. My case had been straightforward, not much to go on, so it was a matter of getting me sentenced for what I was carrying. I cleaned myself up and was taken from the prison, handcuffed to the local gendarme. I was then whipped to the local court in Bayonne. I was placed in a holding room where I was visited by my solicitor who was representing me in the case. He was accompanied by a translator who explained to me that I would be sat in front of the judge, prosecutor, and a jury. To the rear of me would be the douane, customs, and members of the public, who of which were local law students, who I hoped would take pity on me as these young people were to cast their opinion on my case. Then the judge makes her decision on my sentence. I entered the courtroom with my heart in my throat. This courtroom had the power to imprison an offender for a maximum of 10 years. My case was read by the translator at the side of me, and she explained what was being said. My French was not perfect, but I understood a few words. The customs officer behind me didn't have many good words to say about me, other than that I was a repeat offender and I had probably done my crime many times before. This was not true, which I knew, but the judge needed to believe me. The prosecution had their say and made their decision. They were asking for 4 years. At this point I was feeling worried. My solicitor finally had his say and explained my story, which was the truth if you decided to believe it. I was in a lot of debt back home, and I decided to take on a job for a guy I knew of in a pub. I was naive but desperate to clear all my financial worries. There wasn't much more to it. After this was said, the judge and jury took time out for deliberation and returned 15 minutes later. I was told to stand while the judge passed sentence. This was a completely nerve-wracking moment. My name was read to me, then a few other French words were spoken. My translator was talking to me after each sentence was spoken. Then the judge ended with 3 ans. I knew what that was. The prosecution asked for 4, and the judge gave 3 years. I was slightly relieved, but not totally happy. This sentence came with a 5-year expulsion from France plus a customs fine of 1,250,000 French francs, which was the equivalent of £125,000. Being in my desperate situation from the start, I thought that this was a little excessive. This fine was separate from my sentence. The customs had control over the fine, and at this point I was told that if it was not paid, there would be an additional 5 years on top of my sentence for non-payment of the customs fine. This nearly broke me there and then. I felt sick, and I could not understand how the French customs could give you a fine for illegal, non-taxable contraband. But it could have been worse, couldn't it? I'd already done 10 months, so if I was to get parole at 1.5 years, this would not leave me much more to do. But this again would be another long process, as I was to be shipped out to a main prison the morning following my court case. I left the courtroom and took the return journey back to the remand centre to pack my things, ready for the journey which I was told by my solicitor would be to Nouvec prison, about 30 miles out from Bordeaux. I spent the last night with my cellmates Dave, Ulf and Costa, drinking the home brew that we'd been saving for a special occasion, which happened to be tonight. This was a home brew that we'd been fermenting for the last 3 weeks, which consisted of apples, apple juice, sugar, bread, water, a couple of plastic containers and a large sock. Don't worry, the sock was a new one, but I will leave it to you to decide in which order you needed to put these items together. We had a few laughs and got quite pissed. We'd put a couple of bottles onto the window ledge so the night air would chill them whilst we played cards. Accompanying our home brew was a few marijuana spliffs, the perfect accompaniment to any party. Me and Dave played our card game with English good sportsmanship and dignity, while the Dutchman and the German played the game, which had lasted around 30 minutes. It took an hour and 30 because of the arguing. Me and Dave just laughed. Maybe the weed added to the hysteria anyway. We chatted and talked bullshit until one of the screws took a random inspection of the cell, a normal feature that happens from time to time. It was like slow motion. The bolts went on the door as we scrambled to clear up the weed and waft as much smell of cannabis as we could through the open window. The keys to the cell door turned just as we'd sat back down in an inconspicuous manner, not realizing we'd forgotten the home brew on the windowsill. The screw looked at us. My heart was pounding, and at that precise moment It could not have been timed more perfect. One of the tops of the homebrew exploded, sending hooch gushing everywhere. We all looked at each other in dismay. Luckily enough for us, though, the screw that was on the inspect was a bit of a drinker himself, as many times before we'd smelled it on him. So he seemed not to take much notice of this incident, just a cheeky grin he shone. The cell door closed, bolts were thrown back, keys locked, and all we could do was laugh to each other and carried on with our card playing. This was probably one of the best nights I'd spent in here since I arrived, but my next experience was awaiting me in the morning on my trek to Nuvik, where I was to spend the rest of my sentence. Chapter 17. It was an early start, an hour before breakfast was to be served at 6 a.m. I said my goodbyes to my cellmates, then it was off to the minibus, handcuffed and escorted by 2 prison officers, along with a few other criminals, totaling 10. We were marched in single file to the main gates, where we were then unhandcuffed and put into a more or less bulletproof bus. We were then guided into separate compartments of this prison minibus. The journey was going to take around 4 hours, and we were all packed in like sardines. Half the prisoners I was on board with stank of piss because they didn't give a shit about their personal hygiene. Being locked up for 22 hours and wrecking their cell, turning it into a shithole, these people needed to be locked up. It was a space 2 foot by 2 foot, not enough room to swing a kitten, let alone a cat. The containers gave little light from the outside, an 8 by 8 inch window, which was misted over. Obviously, if you were driving down the motorway, nobody wants to see some lunatic criminal flashing obscenities at them. The journey seemed to last forever with a few bumps and grinds, but we eventually arrived at Nuvik Prison, Nuvik surreal. The sound of automatic shutters echoed as we drove into the main entrance to the prison. The van doors were opened, and we were offloaded one by one, which took another hour, and I was gagging for a drink of water, but from this point I learnt to realize that there was another 3 hours' wait in a holding cell. My turn had arrived after the piss-stenched prisoners had checked in. Once into the reception area, my details were handed to the new screws, and the screws from Bayonne left. I was strip-searched, given a photograph swipe card, and placed into a holding cell and awaited my escort into the prison. Another hour lapsed, and then I was moved into a cell away from the main prison. This is called segregation. You're held here for 1 week for medical tests before being moved into the general prison population. Once again, this way was to make sure you'd not carried diseases into the prison. This is where I stayed for 24 hours a day in a bare cell with no luxuries. Meals were brought to me, and with access to the shower once a day, which was a relief compared to the remand centre in Bayonne. I was able to purchase a phone card, and once per day I was able to call home. The sound of my family's voice was music to my ears. It had been 10 months since hearing them, and they gave me a lot of reassurance to get me through my predicament, so this made me stronger. After 1 week of near mental boredom and insanity, I was moved onto the main prison, Wing B, 2nd floor. This wing was one long corridor of cells, with a gate giving prisoners limited exit and entry with your swipe card. I was given a key to my cell and left to my own devices. Once again, I was going to have to work out the way to get by in this prison. I unpacked my belongings, arranged my bed, and hung up my clothes in a small wardrobe provided. This place was a lot better than Bayonne, as it was a fairly new prison. My cell was about 10 foot by 4 foot, with a small table and chair, a separate small toilet with sink, and a view out of the barred windows over a full-sized football pitch. Far from this there was a view into what looked like a forest, literally in the middle of nowhere. I decided to have a wander down the corridor in search of any English life. There seemed to be a lot of shouting in a foreign language, but it wasn't French. It came from a cell about 3 down. I walked past and into the shared kitchen where a few people sat. I decided to make a cup of coffee from the sachets that were distributed to each prisoner every morning. This is when I met an old guy named Alan. A full-on Cockney geezer. He told me that he'd been given 6 years for importation of cannabis, 240 kilos of the stuff. He had already done 2 years of it, and he hoped to be released in 1 year's time, if his parole was accepted. I took my coffee and followed him to his cell, where we sat and chatted. He told me there were about 8 more English guys in here. The rest were dirty Moroccans, Iraqis, and other immigrant throwbacks, and he said he'd been working in the prison warehouse for the past year, doing a menial job making insoles. He said the pay was not that good, but it got you away from all the scum that hung around doing nothing but taking drugs. I liked his sentiments, and he seemed like a down-to-earth guy. At this point, a screw came to the front of the gates and shouted, "Le Poste," which in English meant the post. Alan's delivery was a large brown package of various newspapers from England, which was great, as I had not read anything or heard any news from England for 10 months. Dinner time was approaching, and after one of the services general had delivered our lovely selection of French delicacies, it was a similar lock-up as Bayonne for the change of guards. This procedure took an hour. In this time I read some of the newspapers Alan had gave me. The hour went quickly before our cells were open once more. I locked my cell and went straight over to Alan's cell again, where he was preparing for his afternoon in the factory, and he told me that if I wanted to work in there it was the usual routine of writing to the prison governor. After Alan left for work, I decided to go back to my cell and read a book, Bravo 20 by Andy McNabb. Then I heard prisoners going through the gates at the end. I looked out of my cell and noticed that a number of prisoners had gone through. I picked up my swipe card, locked my cell door, and walked to the end. At this point there was nobody left in their cells. I was stood at the end where the gates were and wasn't sure how to get through when I noticed at the side of me was a swipe machine for my card. I slid it through and there was a loud click, the gate unlocked, and I had to push it open. I walked through another door into a stairwell where I walked down to the ground level, through another swipe card gate, out of another door where a screw stood outside, and into the football field, the view that I'd seen from my cell window. There were people that were walking around the outside of the football field. To the rear of the football field was a small basketball court, tennis court, and volleyball court. All these amenities were in use from an interracial group of prisoners. The weather was extremely hot, way into the 80s. I felt like a bit of a spare part, as everybody seemed to be doing something, so I just decided to follow the train of prisoners around the football field, keeping my ears out for any English-speaking prisoners, which I found a lack of at this point. Languages I couldn't understand. They might as well have been Martian. After a number of times walking around the field and watching the football that was being played or trying to be played, as the number of players were Moroccan and their tendency was more to argue than actual playing, I decided to sit down on some steps at the back of the goals, where a big guy was stood in the nets, dressed from head to toe in U.S. Army combat gear, shouting and swearing at the players in English. This was music to my ears. His name was John Castillo. He was in there with his brother, Juan Carlos Castillo. Both of Colombian origin, his brother was the guy I'd noticed run past me about 10 times, sweating his head off around the football field. John had been in the U.S. Marines for the past 4 years, and his brother had just finished a 6-year sentence in a Paris prison, before being caught once more with his brother. After their partying in Amsterdam, they'd been caught at the French border with 120,000 ecstasy tablets. The judge had given them 4 years each, They didn't care about the French justice system, as when they were both interviewed, each of them had put a story together that matched up perfectly. It lasted about an hour, where the judge was hoping it would come to a conclusion where the ecstasy was heading, and the confession from them both, hopefully leading the judge into information about a big ecstasy smuggling ring. But at the end of the story they made a fool out of the judge by saying they were looking for the best croissant in France. The judge didn't take this lightly, hence their sentence. The 6 years that Juan had served before this sentence, 3 years of it was served in the French Foreign Legion. His sentence was for the export of weapons into the Basque country. This is where an ongoing terrorism issue takes place. At the end of the exercise period, I joined up with these two for a chat. Chapter 18. I introduced myself and told them of my own misfortunes that had happened to me. They were very friendly, and we arranged for another meeting the day after on the next exercise period. But for now it was back to the cell block for dinner and the final night's lockdown. John and Juan proceeded to another block on the other side of the prison. The prison comprised of 12 blocks. An overhead view would look like 3 forks, with long walkways connecting to a circular section central of the adjoining forks. The central section comprised of the prison kitchen, schooling areas, medical dentistry, gym facilities, laundrette, prison canteen, and workhouse where Alan worked. The place was quite vast, comprising of at least 5,000 prisoners. I followed the procession of prisoners back to my block, the same route I'd taken on my way out to the exercise field. I went back to my cell. Alan was not back from the workhouse, so I got my wash bag and towel and proceeded to the showers, which were situated on all cell blocks and were free to use at any time, which was a total relief compared to the twice-a-week ritual at Bayonne. After showering, our block service general worker arrived with the night's meal delights. This worker delivered our meals 3 times per day. He collected the food at set times throughout the day from the kitchens, where they were prepared and placed into a sealed trolley, which the guards opened and vigorously checked on arrival at our block. This was to prevent any type of trafficking from one block to another. I collected the night's food, which, as per usual, was nothing to shout about. The food was sealed in plastic trays which were then microwaved at your own convenience. I left mine for a while, as there was always a mad rush from the rest of the animals, in the guerrilla style, "I want to eat first." Alan had arrived back, so I strolled over to his cell for a quick chat before I ate. We sat down and he told me of his story, of how he'd come to be in this God-forsaken place. He owned his own bar in Portugal and needed a cash injection for his business, as he was to put an extension on his premises. To do this, he was given the job of taking a large consignment of cannabis the same way as me, and lo and behold, faced the same consequences as me, a nice stop from the douane. His bar was now being run by his wife, who'd found out from Alan about his sentence, and she then filed for divorce, as she was not the type to wait around. And to rub salt in the wounds of Alan, she was trying for full ownership of his bar, which infuriated Alan, so he was making counterclaims with his solicitor for the sole possession himself. That was pretty much it for Alan's story. He had mentioned to me that there were jobs available in the workhouse, so I said my goodbyes for the night to Alan, heated up my meal, and retired to my cell to eat and write a letter for work. Shortly after, the guards arrived and locked the block down for the night. I sat at my table, switched on the TV, which I rented from the prison, as it was a privately run prison and these amenities could be taken advantage of. I decided to write my letter for employment and stared out of the barred window of my cell. I finished the letter and placed it in an envelope ready for delivery to the guard in the morning. I lay on my bed watching a variety of French rubbish, trying to blank out the shouting from various foreign convicts from the windows outside my cell. This was combined with the monotonous sound of Moroccan religious music, which was played every night into the small hours of the morning. As it began to get dark, I drifted off to sleep. Chapter 19. The morning arrived once more. Every waking day seemed like I was waking up to a nightmare, realizing that I was still here in this foreign country. It felt lonely and desolate. The jangling of keys could be heard, as of every morning the prison guards arriving to unlock the cell doors, along with the service general delivering breakfast. The loud clicking sound on the gate at the end of the corridor, as the workers headed off for the morning shift. Today was when I received my letter confirming my position in the workhouse. I was to go for my work briefing and the job I was to undertake. It was after dinner time when I was called down to the workhouse, where my role was explained, and I started my job. It was quite tedious, gluing shoe insoles together. Alan had spoken to one of the prison guards for me to work with him, as there were only a few English guys working in here. The work was a monotonous process. It was the kind of work what other companies wouldn't take on, so it was sent to this privately run prison for the inmates to do. While the prison took a healthy profit, the inmates were earning pittance, but you had to put your mind at ease somewhere, other than sitting around your cell block all day doing nothing, and there was only so much masturbation you could manage in one day. The strange thing about this workplace was that there was another section of the factory where children's party stuff was being packaged: balloons, glitter, stickers, etc. The workers for this job were convicted sex offenders, which I and many others found quite unnerving. Who knows what goes through the minds of them sort of people? It was my first week in the workhouse when one of the nonces was attacked severely and quickly by another inmate, who was another French guy serving time for a violent assault. I didn't actually see it, but I heard it all right. From where I stood, it was about 10 feet away. I turned when I heard a scream like a banshee. The offender had walked casually back after sticking a pair of scissors into the other guy's eye. It was like a scene out of a horror film. Blood spurted everywhere. It was a sickening sight, enough for me to feel unsafe in this environment. So that was my first and last week in the workhouse. I decided to get a bit more French schooling, which I'd started in Bayonne. If I was to brush up my French language, I would be able to apply for work in the kitchen, as my usual job in England was a chef. So this is what I decided to do. I spent 2 months, 2 hours twice per week, learning the language. Then I was offered the job. This was more my thing. I had a responsible position in the kitchen. I, with about 10 other guys, prepared on a large scale the meals for all the 5,000 inmates in there. Time went fast, and it was a month into my job when I came down with the problem with my wisdom teeth. I was in agony. The dentist referred me to the hospital that was situated about 3 miles from the prison. I was put into a hospital room that was designed specially for prisoners. No handle on the inside of the door, and 2 prison guards waiting on the outside. You would think that I'd committed mass murder. I was given an anesthetic, which made me totally drowsy, the same feeling as having a bottle of wine. I waited what seemed like hours, but everything seemed like hours when you're in prison. I became a little paranoid to what was going to happen, as I'd been to the dentist before, and never been through what I was going through now. I was trying to sleep, but having trouble due to the window of the room being ajar, complete with bars to stop me from escaping, even though one of my feet was handcuffed to the bed. I was visited by a mosquito which decided to buzz around my ear. I was already bitten to pieces by these little critters, so it was virtually impossible to sleep, because of the fear of me drifting off and being bitten even more. The time scale had now become irrelevant. While waiting in this room, that was completely bare, just me and the greedy mosquito. The door opened and I was wheeled into an operating theatre. I thought this was madness just for one wisdom tooth, but I was that much out of my tree with the drugs the nurse had injected me with, I didn't complain much. I was given some gas to knock me out while they went to work. I didn't remember anything until I woke. The process seemed fast, to what I could recollect, but when I awoke my mouth felt like it had been hit with a hammer. I was given a leaflet by the dentist, re-handcuffed, and put back into the van that had brought me here. Still feeling drowsy, the prison guards unlocked my cuffs and locked me in for the journey back to Newvic prison. I started to read the leaflet. It explained the procedures to take after having my teeth taken out. I went in for one, but they'd taken out all 4. Maybe this was to stop repeat journeys, but as far as I'm concerned, there was only one that needed to be removed. On arrival back at the prison, I went to visit Alan, who thought the whole incident was quite funny. I didn't share his sense of humour, but at this point was just pissed off with the roughness they'd used. I felt like I'd just visited an abattoir, but prison life must go on. I'd spent 15 months up to now in the prison regime, and there seemed no end in sight yet. My sentence was 3 years, feeling like 15 years, but I was now eligible for early release. Each prison commission board, which granted you this gift, as the French put it, was to be held in 4 weeks' time, so I made my application to the juge d'applications, just another judge on the payroll that dealt with people's lives. After a week of recuperation, it was back to the kitchens for my job to proceed again, with the hope of no more prison visits. Think again. Chapter 20. On my return back to the kitchen, the guy I'd met earlier that I'd mentioned, Juan Castillo, the Colombian, had arrived in the kitchen. I thought to myself this would go good now, as I knew he had the prison guards under control, and if he could make his life easier in there, so could I. The first couple of days he'd arranged for the service general who delivered the food to the blocks to do his trafficking, which consisted of full cooked beef joints and various other delicacies. The guards never checked the food trolley on its halfway point to the blocks, but only on arrival, so during the transfer along the corridors to the blocks, the service general was met by a Moroccan inmate who picked the padlock to the food trolley, unloaded the goods into a plastic bag, and then off to the block for delivery to Juan's cell. He resided 1 floor above me, and apparently his cell looked like Sheikh Mohammed's palace. Once Juan's goods had arrived, they were hidden to the best they could until he arrived the following afternoon, when work was finished. This food could then be exchanged for cannabis, whiskey, cigarettes, anything really. The contraband was brought in by prisoners from the outside. God knows how it was done, but anything was available from the outside for the right price. Prison security was not as smart as they thought they were. Anyway, I became Juan's friend one day when he'd broken his reading glasses. I myself had come to the prison with 3 pairs of spectacles. These items were one thing he couldn't get from his illegal trafficking. It takes a long time, like anything in the prison system, and spectacles were at least a 2-month wait. As you know, everyone needs a prescription for the right vision. But the day that he'd broken them, I mentioned that I had a spare pair if he would like them. I asked for nothing at this stage, just for him to try them and see how he goes. The next day, to my disbelief, the glasses were perfect for his eyes. He couldn't thank me enough, and from this time on my life was easy. It was now my 19th month in the prison. My cell was looking like Juan's, and I had the respect and friendship from other inmates because I was friendly with a Colombian arms dealer. With this guy as my backup, who wouldn't be friendly with you? My commission date had arrived for possible parole. It was set for June the 1st, 2002 at 10 a.m. It was now May the 2nd, 2002. This is when things took a turn for the worst once more, as I was having an episode of appendix problems. I did not know this at the time, but things were going to get tough once more. It was a Sunday, and very little happens over the weekend in prison, so there were only 2 guards per each 3-tier prison block. My cell window was wide open. It was scorching outside, but I was freezing. I knew this was not a good sign. I was feeling dizzy, and I was finding it hard to move because of the pain. Luckily, a French guy who passed my cell spoke a little English, came in, and I explained to him the problem. He went straight to the intercom that was positioned on the side of the cell doors. These were to be used in emergency and to use the phones. The French guy began to call the guards, and it was about 15 minutes before he got a reply, and even then, because prisoners misuse the intercom and try any excuse to get out of the block for a wander, he did not seem to take much notice. My condition was becoming more serious. After about 4 attempts to get the guard to believe me, he arrived, and he sent me down to the infirmary, where I had to wait for a while until the doctor arrived. Once he arrived, he could tell straight away this was no prank. I was placed into a wheelchair, handcuffed at the legs, and scooted off to a waiting ambulance. One prison guard followed this time. I wasn't going to the hospital where I had my teeth out, but I was going to Bordeaux Hospital. I travelled in the ambulance, and every bump on the road jolted pains into my abdomen. It seemed like I was slipping in and out of consciousness. It was about an hour's journey before arriving at the St. Nicholas Hospital in Bordeaux. I was moved out of the ambulance, through the double emergency doors, and down the corridor into the hospital. First I was taken into a small cubicle where I was met with a female nurse who decided that my illness might be through ingesting drugs due to the stomach pains. Well, the matron decided to slip on the rubbers and less than gently poke around in the anal slot for trapped drugs. This made the pain even more excruciating. She didn't find anything, so I was taken up to a private ward where the guard that had brought me from the prison was met by the local gendarmerie, 2 of them. I was moved from my wheelchair and put onto a bed. Here, once again, I was handcuffed by my feet to the bed. After an hour or so of pain and frustration, I was seen to by a doctor who placed an IV drip into my arm and explained that I was going to need an operation, but he couldn't do it tonight, as I had a fever, and this needed to be controlled before surgery. I asked him why the operation. He replied that I had an abscess on my appendix which needed removing along with the appendix. He said hopefully this will take place in the morning. Until then, I needed to rest. It was around 7:30 p.m. on Sunday night. I felt like shit, and there were 2 coppers guarding me with guns outside the room, and I was handcuffed by my feet, just in case I made a mad dash for the barred windows. I had a drip hanging out of my arm, and last but not least, I had a fever and a life-threatening medical condition. Life couldn't get any better. Chapter 21. The morning came, and I was still full of the worst-feeling flu you can imagine. My temperature had slowed down, which gave the doctors the go-ahead. I was rushed into the operating room and given a needle with God knows what was in it, but it knocked me clean out. When I came round, I felt really drowsy. I had 2 IV drips going on. At this point, I was that high on morphine, I was saying bonjour to all and sundry. I can't remember the time that it took me to recover, but I was back in my own personal hospital bed with the French police guarding my every move. I had had a quite complex operation, which consisted of keyhole surgery. I'd had an abscess growing on my appendix. This was life-threatening at the time of my symptoms, so it was a good job I was admitted to hospital when I was back at the prison. I stayed in a single hospital cubicle for 10 days, with police guarding me 24 hours per day. There was a change of police shifts 3 times per day while I recovered. The 10 days dragged on until the day of my return came back to the prison. I arrived back at my prison block, where I was met by Alan. I sat in his cell and told him of my experience. He told me that nothing exciting had happened on my 10 days out, only the usual prison life, which is a monotonous journey. The guards arrived for the final lockdown of the night. I returned to my cell and relaxed, as I was still feeling under the weather after my operation. I fell asleep earlier than I usually did that night. It was the best night's sleep I'd had in 10 days. Chapter 22. I awoke to the Moroccan hymn chanting early, around 6:30 a.m. The sun was beginning to heat up, so I opened up the window for a little fresh air. The guards did not open up the cells until 7:30 a.m., so I decided to write a letter to my mother back home. After finishing the letter, the guards opened up my cell and delivered me a letter addressed from the Magistrates' Commission Board. This was good news. This was what I'd been waiting for. The letter was a date for me to sit on the Commission Board for a review, into my stay at the detention centre. It was to find out whether I should be granted early release. I was 1 year and 7 months into my sentence. If I was to get my parole, I could be out in another 5 months, but this was not going to be an easy task. My date was set for 3 weeks' time, and in this time I needed to settle my customs fine, which was 175,000 francs. This roughly worked out in English pounds at £75,000. I knew this amount was impossible for me to raise, so a little bit of bartering was going to have to be done. Not only this, I would have to convince the Commission Board that I'd learnt my lesson. The guidelines for this procedure was to have no issues going on inside the prison and chance of employment on my return to England. I started another letter, first to Customs Office. The whole reason I was in this mess in the first place was because I was short of money in England and in a mountain of debt, so the Customs asking for this kind of amount was ludicrous. Before leaving England, I'd been waiting for an employment tribunal answer from my previous workplace. I'd rang my father the week before, and he'd informed me that I'd won my case and had received a cheque for £1,800. Luckily for the Customs Office, but unlucky for me, this was going to be the money I was going to have to offer the Customs Office for my fine. I'd been told from other prisoners that the French Customs were willing to accept a percentage of the actual fine, but the bartering process could be lengthy and an agreement was hard to win, but nevertheless I was going to have to give it a go. I started my letter explaining that the only money that was available to me was £800. The way I was told by other inmates were to start low, as I would surely have to pay more. I finished the letter and started my other letter to the Commission Board as to why I should be released. I knocked up a couple of reasons before sealing both my letters and posting them in the box at the end of my cell block. It was a Saturday, and nothing really happens on a weekend, so I went over to Alan's cell for a chat. He'd received a letter from his soon-to-be ex-wife, so he was not in the pleasantest of mood, but we began talking anyway, just idle chit-chat. He told me a story of when he was younger, when he and two of his Cockney geezer friends had scammed an expensive shoe shop in the Kensington area of London. They'd had a tip-off from a truck driver that there was a certain morning that there would be a delivery of Italian shoes, so he and his guys thought up a good scam. Alan himself arrived outside the shoe shop dressed in a smart suit 1 hour before opening time, just as the delivery guy had arrived. Alan spotted the truck pulling up, so he took out a bunch of keys and made it look like he was opening up the shutters to the shop. The truck driver alighted from his cabin with a clipboard and spoke to Alan in broken English about the delivery. Alan cursed to himself, shook the bunch of keys, and told him that his colleague had given him the wrong ones and that he'd be at least another 40 minutes before arriving. He then said to the driver would he like to go to a nearby cafe where they'd done the best English breakfast in the whole of London and wait for his member of staff to arrive with the shop keys. The Italian agreed, leaving the truck unaccompanied. They set off to an old greasy cafe around the corner. Meanwhile, across the road, two of Alan's accomplices were sat watching the whole event. One of them went over to the truck, broke in, and barrel-pulled the ignition, and away it went. There had been a set timing between the group. After 15 minutes of being sat with the duped Italian, Alan slipped to the toilet, out the back door, around the corner, and into a waiting car, and off. They'd made away with around £30,000 of Gucci and Prada shoes. The wives of the three were happy that night. A few hours and a few coffees later, it was time for the afternoon lock-up. The weekend passed slowly. It was Monday morning, and time to pick up my canteen order, and every Monday ritual together with the whole block. The canteen was at the far end of the prison. It was the worst queuing system you could imagine. If you were not vigilant, you could spend most of the day waiting for your supplies. Luckily for me, I was in with the Colombian brothers, Juan and John, so it was a quick and swift shuffle to the front of the queue. After taking my supplies back to my cell, I went down to the exercise field and played a little basketball with the Colombian brothers in the sweltering heat. The usual football game ensued, lawless and ruleless, prisoners walking around the fields, and some relaxing in the sunbathing position topping up the tan. Just a normal day. There was no hope of rehabilitation to this place. You just had to sit back and ride out your sentence to the best way you could. Some prisoners could not handle the relentless routine, and there were many suicides during my stay. But there was no way I'd be taking that easy way out. The afternoon was over, and it was back to the cell block and a shower before tea time. After tea, I made a phone call home and explained to my father I'd written to the Commission and the Customs. My father told me he'd deposited my cheque from my tribunal, and the monies were there as soon as I needed them. This was a relief for a start, but the next mission was to persuade the Customs of my offer of 800 quid. Chapter 23. A couple of weeks passed, and it was time for my commission hearing. It was set for the afternoon at 2:40 p.m. I had still no reply from the Customs, and was feeling quite nervous, as the Commission Board could reject your parole if your customs fine was not settled. I could not believe my luck. Dinner time had arrived, and I received a letter from the Customs. It could not have been timed any better. I opened the letter with haste and began reading. It was written in French, so I done my best to translate. The majority was jargon, but the main part was at the bottom. The Customs had refused my £800 offer, but was willing to accept £1,200. I was relieved. Everything was complete and in order for this afternoon's commission. I had a letter that my father had sent giving instructions of employment on my return to England. The guards locked up for dinner, and I got ready for the Commission Board. After the changing of the guards and the reopening of the cells, I just hung around the cell block impatiently and nervously until the moment arrived. I was escorted down to the holding block adjacent to the Commission's offices. There were other detainees waiting for their hearing, excited and nervous, just as I was. After a few hours late, it was my turn to face my fate. I was ushered into a small room where two of the Commission officers sat facing me. I sat alongside my translator. The hearing took around half an hour. During this time there was an array of questions consisting of how my behaviour had been inside the prison, to what my intentions were to be on my return to England. I had said all I could say now. It was up to the board to decide my fate. They said I would find out the decision in 1 week's time, so it was back to the cell block, where I decided to make a call to my father to tell him the process of sending the money to the Customs. Once it was arranged, it was just a matter of time to find out my answer to the Commission Board's decision. It was 4 p.m. and time for an afternoon stroll around the football field with my two Colombian friends, Juan and John. The conversation was small, as always. The highlight of the afternoon was a fight breaking out with the French and Moroccan clique. There was a little bloodshed before one of the screws broke it up. An hour into my stroll, and it was back once more to the cell block for dinner, and then the final lockdown for the night. I had a sleepless night, thinking only of what my outcome to commission hearing would be. It was a week later when I got a letter from the Commission. My heart beat hard as I opened the large brown envelope, and I knew it was from them, as previous letters I'd seen from other inmates. I pulled out the letter slowly and began reading. It was a result. I had got what I wanted, a release date, which was to be in 1 month's time, the 4th of July, 2002. I was ecstatic. The feeling was overwhelming. It had been just under 2 years in this hell. My release date would make my total stay 2 years and 3 weeks. Not as much as some of the other guys in here, but enough punishment for me. There were inmates in that place that were habitual criminals, but who was to judge them? Half the crims were so used to the system that they knew the ropes. But to a foreigner, that was a different story. But hey, who cares? I was on my way out. I went over to Alan's cell to tell him the news. He was happy for me, but only in a matter-of-fact way. He had enough problems to feel my excitement. The day went as per usual, the same rigmarole, so I hooked up with my friends Juan and John. They were up to some shit that I didn't want to be involved in, knowing that I was going to be released soon, but anyhow, prison life must go on. Chapter 24. The day had come. Time for my release, the 4th of July 2002. One big milestone of my life. The release was for the afternoon, but I wasn't being let out the front gates. Oh no, that would be too easy. My first stop was to stay one more night, still inside the prison, but on the wing for prisoners to be released. I said my goodbyes to the British clique, and hope I never see you again to the screws. I was on my way home as I wheeled a trolley down the corridor of this very large prison. I recapped the moments in my mind, and was amazed to think that however did I make it through this tough time, the violence, the boredom, the loneliness, the fear, and not forgetting the 2 operations I'd undergone. It was hard to contemplate. I arrived at the halfway cell. It was 2:45 p.m., and this is where I'd be staying for the next 15 hours, until my next part of the journey home, which was a few hours' drive in the sweat van to Charles de Gaulle Airport. The cell door opened at 6 a.m. and off I went. I had a distorted view out the window of the cattle truck. There was not much room to move either, only about 2 foot by 4 foot. The prison just faded away into the distance as the old sweat van rumbled onto the tarmac of the French motorway. My arrival at the deportation centre at Charles de Gaulle Airport was again to turn into an arduous wait until there was a spare seat on a flight to England. This to me seemed a little excessive, but the procedures had to be adhered to. After all, I couldn't see the French authorities paying for a first-class ticket with extra legroom. It was 8 hours later I heard the lock on the cell door go. 2 police waved me out. I left the makeshift deportation cabins and into a waiting police car. I couldn't believe it when the police car went straight through a gate and onto the runways of the airport. I was being escorted straight to the plane. I laughed to myself and thought, this is so surreal. It was like something that could really only be associated with Ronnie Biggs on an extradition order. We arrived at the foot of the plane. The roaring engines sounded mean. I looked around as the police led me up the stairs and noticed a bus about 50 yards to the left of the plane. Up till this point I thought I was going to be walked onto the plane in front of all the passengers with a copper on each arm, but to my surprise it was empty. I then realized that the bus I'd seen, they were the passengers to the plane I would be flying on. To this day, I think, as a final insult from the French government was to put me at the back of the plane before any other passengers, for them to have a good look at the bad guy. The police debarked from the plane, and from this point on I became a free man. The passengers embarked, so I just buried my head in an in-flight magazine. There were 4 seats to the area where I sat, and 2 English couples sat a-facing. The plane door was tightly shut by one of the stewardesses, and the plane began to taxi onto the runway. I felt a satisfying sense of happiness. After take-off and a nice serving of lager, which I ordered in French to the hot stewardess, I listened to the conversations in front of me from the couples. They'd stayed in Paris for a few days and didn't seem to be happy with their stay. They were the moaning sort and made their point across to each other of how bad the French were. The stewardess had passed me and asked in French if everything was okay with the in-flight meal and drinks. After the shit I'd been eating for the past 2 years, this plain food was like dining at the Ritz. I replied back in French everything was perfect, and at this point the couples in front of me presumed I was a Frenchman and began having a little joke to themselves at my expense. I carried on speaking French throughout the 1-hour flight and carried on listening and trying to hold my laughter back to the little jaunts the couple entertained themselves to. The flight went swimmingly, and it was touchdown at Manchester Airport. I'd arranged for my mother to pick me up from the airport. I made the call at the deportation centre at Charles de Gaulle. I'd explained to my mother I would call her if I successfully made it through English customs, as I had heard rumours about the English police force maybe waiting, wanting more answers. Me and the rest of the passengers began to leave the plane, and on leaving the plane the couples that sat facing me started to walk in a different direction. I quickly said to them, in a Manchester accent, "I'm not really French." They looked startled. I smiled and walked in a different direction. I nervously approached the nothing to declare section and passed through. There was no one there. I'd made it. My nightmare had come to an end, and the presence of that horrible 2 years was over. I was unable to return to France for 5 years. An expulsion order had been in place as part of my sentence, but I didn't want to go back there anyway. I made the call to my mother. It was big hugs on her arrival. We set off back home to where I was going to have to pick up the pieces I'd left broken before my visit to France. Memoirs of a Mule.